Good evening, everybody, and welcome and thank you for coming to another edition of the Jewish Destiny series, the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and it is an absolute pleasure to be with you here tonight. And it's so good to see all you out here on a Tuesday night when there's so many things competing for our attention, like Israeli elections and sports and whatnot. So I just want to, from the bottom of my heart, thank you all for being here. You know, there's a big discussion and I guess a little bit of a debate amongst rabbinic circles that when you have weeks in the world like we had this past week, if you discuss it regularly, how long you discuss it for, and at what point people are just, sick and tired of hearing about it. Everyone has their own thoughts, their own minds, and their own way of looking at things. And, it's after a while, people start to think that if a rabbi doesn't put his 2 cents in, that they might take his smicha away. So that's why, if you're wondering where you're getting articles from every single rabbi and outlet that you know about the Meron tragedy, that's probably why. But the one of the reasons why the position of not saying anything or not speaking about it is because there's just nothing to say. When you have a tragedy that's so inexplicable, that's so beyond comprehension, that's so impossible to understand, there's nothing to say. There's just nothing to say, nothing to talk about. For those of you who had the opportunity to read my own personal involvement, if you will, if you have not, it's on my social media posts, it's on rabbilandis.com. And but in short, our daughter was in Meron on Thursday night, and we knew she was in Meron, and we got the notices of what was going on in Meron starting about 6:45 p.m. and we're not able to get in touch with her till about 8:15 p.m. And not knowing what was the details, not knowing exactly what happened, just knowing that the death toll was rising and the details were not coming in. And, I'm sure you can all imagine how a parent's mind is racing in that moment, or those moments, that hour and a half, really. And, so my personal lesson that I took from it is that when we finally heard from her, when we finally got the call and saw her number on the phone, at that point, all the emotion comes forward, and I realized that as Jews, we have an obligation, what's called noseh b'olim chavero, that we're supposed to carry the burden of our friend. That when we see our friend, and by friend we mean another Jew, another person, another human being, when a person is in a time of trouble, a time of sorrow, as the Beatles once said, we're not supposed to just like walk the other way, turn the other way, not pay attention. No, we're supposed to noseh b'olim chavero. We're supposed to carry the burden with our friend. And when for a fleeting moment, or in our case, an hour and a half, you think that you could be the one on the other side of that, it makes it a lot easier to carry the burden. And unfortunately, made it that much easier to carry the burden here in Cleveland when about 12 hours later, we found out that tragedy struck in Cleveland. And that Yossi Cohn, the son of Chai Gitti Cohn, was one of the 45 korbanos, one of the 45 who lost their lives. And for those of you who know Mrs. Cohn, she's Menahelis Cohn, as they call her. She's the middle school principal at Yavna, where two of my daughters went. She was the principal for two of my daughters. And she's a lady, an amazing lady in and of herself, not the least of which is a lady who's really gone through her struggles in a major way, because a few years ago, her husband died in a car accident. And now she has the tragedy of her son having died in Meron. And there's no words. There's just no words for such tragedy. There's no words to explain. There's no words. And at a certain point, all we can do is cry. And that's really all we can do. But I think there's a macro lesson that I think we have to keep in mind in this situation, and that is, throughout this whole past year of the corona pandemic and having to adjust to a new life, a new way of doing things, etc. We, for many of us, it's been obvious that there's a message from the Almighty. The Almighty is trying to teach us something. The Almighty expects something from us, because when you have something that's so inexplicable, then it's got to have a lesson. And I almost feel that when you see a tragedy like this that literally galvanizes the Jewish people, it wakes us all up, that you just can't ignore, coming at the end of something like a pandemic. It's a way of saying that we still have to wake up. We still are missing something here as a people, and I don't know what that is. I'm hoping I figure it out. I'm hoping I contribute to whatever it is that is expected of us, so that we don't know tragedies like this anymore. And God willing, as the prophet says, that this should be the end of tears, that Hashem should wipe away the tears from every face, and death should cease to exist forever. So that's just by way of introduction of dealing with some very tough events this week. And I think it is a wonderful segue, or a proper segue, into the story of Avraham Avinu, and to the story of our forefather Abraham, his wife Sarah, and really the story of in many ways, the beginning of the Jewish people. So I'm just going to now post the outline for those of you who like to look at it. I'm going to post the outline in the chat box. And for those of you who are watching later, this will be posted at torahcleveland.com. And that's our outline for tonight. And then this right here is the family tree of our patriarchs, both in Hebrew and in English, patriarchs and our matriarchs. You can look at the family tree as we talk. So when we delve into this conversation of the beginning of the Jewish people, first of all, for those of you who've been wondering how we're going to get through 6,000 years and however much time we're going to do this program, you're here for sessions 2 through 4. You said, oh, we're moving pretty quickly. We covered like 1,600 and something years in just 3 sessions. Like that rate, this will be over in about 10 weeks. And but the problem is this week we're going to start to slow it down, because everything that we were dealing with until now was really the prelude to the Jewish people, and now we really begin the process of the Jewish people. So there's a famous question that if we asked it to the 18 or so people in the Zoom room tonight, if we asked it to the people watching on social media, if we asked it later to those watching on Torah Anytime, I bet you we would get a number of answers. And the question is, who was the first Jew? Who was the first Jew? And maybe take a moment, put it in your chat box there if you have an idea. Who was the first Jew? So if the responses don't come in, I'll just throw out what I think some of the responses could be. Some people might say Noah. Some people might say Abraham. Some people might say Moshe. Some people might say Jacob. Some people might say David HaMelech, King David. Some might say Yehuda. Yeah, there's all kinds of answers to this question. And in truth, to a certain extent, at a certain level, each and every single one of those answers would be correct. But I think at its core, when we ask the question, who was the first Jew? Judah or Mordechai would definitely be up there. But we talk about the core of the Jewish people. Who started? Who was the founder, if you will? When we talk about great companies and great organizations, there's always a founder. Like everyone credits Steve Jobs as being the founder of Apple, which he was one of 3 founders, really. There was Steve Wozniak, and then a founder who I forget his name, but he sold out after his first year for like $100 or $500 or something like that. But every great company has a great founder. So who's the founder of the Jewish people? So if you said Avraham, you would be correct. If you said Moshe, you would be correct. Because I think that just like Google has Sergey Brin and Larry Page as their founders, the Jewish people have Avraham and Moshe, and the committee is everyone in between, so to speak. Now, what do I mean by that? The Jewish people does not start with Avraham. The Jewish people does not. It starts essentially with Avraham. The beginning of the process starts with Avraham, and it ends with Moshe. So in the 400-year process from Abraham to Moses, that's when we have the development of the Jewish people. Okay? Now, what do we mean by that? Let's delve right in and find out. So if you remember back to, I believe, session 1, we talked about how there is a blueprint for all of Jewish history given to us by the Talmud and Sanhedrin. The Talmud and Sanhedrin says Jewish history, the 6,000 years of Jewish history, can be broken up into 3 distinct time periods. The first 2,000 years is the 2,000 years of what's referred to as Tohu, which means 2,000 years of emptiness. Then we have 2,000 years of Torah, and then we have the 2,000 years of Yemos HaMashiach, of the Messianic era. So tonight we are transitioning from the 2,000 years of nothingness, of void, of null and void, to the 2,000 years of Torah. Now, what does that happen to correspond with? So we have Abraham, who was born in the year 1948. Now, that should not be confused with 1948 on the secular calendar that the state of Israel was founded on. This is 1948 on the Jewish calendar, one of those strange coincidences, which means absolutely nothing, but is a ton of fun to throw around at a cocktail party. So Abraham is born in a Jewish year 1948, which corresponds to 1813 before the Common Era. And Abraham becomes a monotheist, as we'll say, or his first action of monotheistic behavior is at the age of 52, corresponding to the year 2000. And when Abraham finally stands up as a monotheist and shows that he is going to proclaim the ideas of monotheism to the world, that, so to speak, sets into motion what we call the 2,000 years of Torah, which will culminate with the Talmud, with the Talmudic era and the writing down of the oral tradition, which we'll get to several weeks from now. So we are now entering the 2,000 years of Torah, which I would actually explain as the 2,000 years of the development of Torah, because the full corpus of Torah is going to go from Abraham to the writing of the Talmud, and that will be the backbone. That'll be the backdrop. That'll be the DNA, if you will, of Jewish intellectia, of Jewish knowledge, of what it means to be a Jew, and it starts with us tonight. Now, there's a famous poem that I meant to look up who actually said the poem. I don't recall, but I'm sure someone here can Google it or knows it already. There's a famous poem that goes, "How odd of God to choose the Jews," right? So we have this concept that we're all familiar with, but I have a feeling that very few of us actually know what it means. And that is that the Jewish people are the chosen people, right? The chosen people. And as we know, there's there's people from like places like Green Bay and Wisconsin. They call themselves the Frozen Chosen, and I think it's Maccabee beer in Israel. It calls itself the Chosen Beer, the Chosen People. Like everyone knows the concept of Jews being the chosen people. And at its surface, in our present society, where we've become over the past year or so a little bit more aware of the differences of cultures, of how we treat other cultures. I would go as far as to say the cancel culture. It could be not so politically correct to call ourselves the chosen people anymore. So I think we really have to examine what it means before we walk around telling people that we're the chosen people, because at least on its surface, it sounds like we're saying, chosen usually is like if you go into a butcher shop and you say, "I want your most choice cut." It means that's the best cut. That's the there's like chuck steak and then there's ribeye steak, and that's the choice cut. So it sounds a little bit precocious of us to call ourselves the chosen people. And dare I say, throughout antiquity, it has been the cause of much anti-Semitism, much hatred of the Jewish people, is the fact that we call ourselves the chosen people. So what does it mean to be the chosen people? So in truth, the end of that poem answers the question and gives us our backdrop for tonight's discussion. How odd of God to choose the Jews. It wasn't so odd the Jews chose God, meaning that people might think on the surface that God, we were all sitting in the park one day and God was walking around and said, "Okay, there's the Ishmaelites over there, the Ishmaelim over there. No, I don't want them. There's the Edomites over there. No, I don't want them. There's the Moabites over there. No, I don't. Oh, they're the Jews. I want the Jews. I'm choosing the Jews. Like, come on, they make a great matzo ball soup, and no one can sing like them. And I really like, that 5'7", dark complexion, brown hair look that they have going. I'm choosing the Jews, right? No, that's not what happened. What happened is we're going to see is the Jews, meaning us or our antecedents, our forefather, Avraham Avinu, he chose God. And once he stood up and chose God, so to speak, then God said, "You know what, Abraham, you're my man." And let's go through that process of how that happened. So we mentioned last week that at this point in the map of world history, 20 generations have passed. In other words, there's 20 generations from Adam and Eve until Abraham. Okay, by generations, we mean father, son. We mean one layer in the family unit, 20 generations. Now, in these 20 generations, as we saw and as we discussed, it wasn't like every single person who exists was a polytheist. It wasn't like every single person who exists denied the concept or didn't believe or didn't understand the concept of monotheism, the concept of one omniscient, all-powerful God. No, we have many famous monotheists who predate Abraham. First of all, we had Adam. Adam was a monotheist. Seemingly Cain and Abel were monotheists. I mean, hey, they got pretty upset when, or at least Cain got pretty upset when God, the monotheistic God, didn't accept his offering. So, there seems to be something going on over there. And we have Mr. Shelach, who is known as a monotheist. We have Chanoch, who is known as a monotheist. We have Noah, who is a monotheist. And not only that, we have one of Noah's 3 sons, who is famous for being a monotheist. And that's none other than Shem, right? Noah has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Yafes. And Shem is a famous monotheist, so much so that we see not through the scripture, but through rabbinic writings, through the homiletic writings, the Aggadic writings, that Shem actually had an academy of monotheism. Shem and one of his great-grandsons or great-great-grandsons, however many ones, whose name was Aver, Shem and Aver, they had a great academy of monotheism. And we see that Abraham studies there, Isaac studies there, Jacob studies there. We see that it's a place where monotheists go to study. So it wasn't, it's not, when we say Abraham was the first Jew, or the first, as we'll say, proto-Jew, it wasn't like he was the first monotheist, because we just listed a whole list of monotheists that came before him. So why do we seemingly give Avram the credit for being the first monotheist? Because while he wasn't the one who, so to speak, discovered monotheism or created monotheism, he was the first evangelical monotheist, right? He was the first preacher of monotheism. He was the first one who got up and stood up and went out there and taught the world about monotheism. Now, you might say, well, didn't Noah try to do that with building the ark? Okay, he might have tried, but as we addressed last week, was he successful? No. How many adherents did he acquire? 0, right? And in the end, he gives up. Shem and Aver, I just said, had a great academy. But you know what the difference is between the academy of Shem and Aver, which taught monotheism, and, so to speak, the school of Abraham? The academy of Shem and Aver was an elitist academy. It was Ivy League, right? You had to get 1,600 on your SATs or 36 on your ACTs, whatever the ACTs are. I still don't understand. But you had to have a 4.2 grade point average. You had to have all the letters of recommendation. And maybe after all that, you could go to the yeshiva Shem Aver and you could go and learn about monotheism from those 2 great men. Abraham had the exact opposite approach. Abraham not only believed in monotheism, but he's the first person who stands up and teaches the world about monotheism. So much so that we see that when Abraham and his second recorded prophecy from the Almighty, one of the things he's told to do is to leave his home and take nefesh asher asu b'Haran, take the souls that he created in the city town of Haran that he lived. What does it mean, the souls that he created? Well, Rashi tells us that the souls that he created are the people that he influenced. Because when a teacher is able to influence someone in a positive Jewish way and bring them to the ideas of monotheism, of Torah, of authentic Torah thought, it's in many ways as if he gave birth to those people. So that's why in many ways in halacha and Jewish law, a person's teacher is the way the laws around respect towards a teacher are very similar to the laws of respecting one's parents, because we look at a teacher as a spiritual parent. So Abraham was a spiritual parent for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not, according to some commentaries, maybe even up to half or a third of the world he had influence with his ideas of monotheism. So before that, Shem, Aver, Noach, all the ones mentioned before, they didn't influence anybody, or they had minor influence. So once you have Avram who comes on the scene and is willing to, so to speak, put himself out there for the Almighty and really give his whole life to try to influence the world and rid the world of polytheism and bring the world into the ideas of monotheism, at that point, the Almighty says, you know what? You're my guy. You know what? You're going to be my team. You're going to be on Team God. You're going to be on Team Monotheism, and we're going to do something great in this world. And the Ramchal, Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, explains that for the first 20 generations of the world, it could have been anybody. In other words, there was no chosenness. There's nothing special, so to speak, about Abraham. that really could have been any of these people or anyone else had they just come along and said, like, I'm with you, God. I get it. I believe it. And I'm willing to go and teach the world about it. It could have been more than just Abraham. There could have been many roots or trunks to the tree, so to speak. But once Abraham, so to speak, goes through the process we're going to discuss tonight, we see that at that point that all this process of teaching monotheism to the world and bringing monotheistic ideas out to the world is all filtered down to and given to Abraham and his descendants to disseminate to the world. Okay. So when we talk about our forefathers, our patriarchs and our matriarchs, there's a concept that comes up a lot in Jewish thought. It's called Maisa Avos Siman Labanim, which means the actions of our antecedents are a harbinger for us. In other words, the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rivka, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah are at a certain point, in a certain way, writing the spiritual DNA for the Jewish people. And many of the actions that they go through in the stories that are told to us in the book of Genesis, in the book of Bereshit, that lays the spiritual DNA for the Jewish people. And we're going to try and bring those ideas out as we go throughout all these sessions of these actions that we see from our forefathers are really laying the blueprint for all of our future generations. And that's the concept you see a lot called Maisa Avos Siman Labanim. The actions of our forefathers, the stories of our forefathers are a harbinger for all the children, for the future generations. Okay, so we have Abraham, born in the year 1948 to a man by the name of Terach and a woman by the name of Amasla Bas Karnavo. Now, we're told Terach's name in the end of Parshas Noach. It's the only time that he is mentioned. And we are told Amasla's name in the Talmud and Bava Basra. It's not mentioned in scripture anywhere. But they are the parents of none other than Avram Avinu. And we're going to see that the development of the Jewish people, the proto-Jew, the proto-family, if you will, that while Avraham is clearly the leader, there is definitely a filtering process from the family of Terach. So there at some level must have been or had to have been something special in Terach and Amasla that you're going to see that it's Abraham, but Abraham is constantly pulling in from his greater family to build the fiber of the Jewish people. And if you look at that family tree that I gave you, that's going to be the story of our next few weeks here. They like to say where I come from in Atlanta, Georgia, that you might be a redneck if you have a family tree with no branches. And that's true in the South, by the way. But to a certain extent, the family of the Jewish people does not have many branches. And if you ever wondered, I think Dr. Emmerman's here in the room. We might have some other medical professionals here. If you ever wondered why the concept of genetic disorders seems to only be a Jewish problem, first of all, it's not only a Jewish problem, but in many ways, first of all, it definitely affected the Habsburg Empire in a major way. But it also does affect the Jewish people because we do have, especially the Ashkenazi community, we have a very small gene pool. And going back to Abraham, but even with all of the different persecutions and genocides and attempted genocides throughout history, the gene pool is quite often very small, especially the Ashkenazi gene pool is extremely small. And that's really in many ways how we start. So if you look at this family tree, I put it there both in Hebrew and English. Page 1's in Hebrew, page 2 is in English. So you can see at the top, we have the family of Terach, and I put Avram over to the side just to be able to organize it. And I didn't come up with this. I borrowed it from someone else, but just to be able to organize it. But we have 3 brothers from Terach. It's a family of 3. We have Nachor, Haran, and Avraham. Okay? Now, if you look at the family, Haran is going to have 3 children, Milcah, Lot, and Sarah. Milcah will become the wife of Nachor. Sarah will become the wife of Avraham. Okay? Fast forward a little bit down here. We're going to see that Nachor and Milcah have a son by the name of Besuel, who have 2 children that we know of. One is Lavan and one is Rivka. We'll meet them later. Rivka will marry Yitzchak, the son of Sarah and Abraham, Sarah and Avraham. And if we take one step further down than that, we're going to see that Lavan has 4 daughters. by the names of Rachel, Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah. By the way, Bilhah and Zilpah are also his daughters. They don't teach you that a lot of times in Sunday school. Rashi tells us they're benos pelagshim, meaning they're daughters of his concubines, whereas Rachel and Leah were daughters of his full wives, whatever that means or whatever that meant to Lavan. But be it as it may, he has these four daughters who become the imahos. The four mothers are really Rachel and Leah, will become the matriarchs of the Jewish people. And that's how we have this whole filtering process of the family of Terach. And by the way, before all is said and done, we're going to have a descendant of Lot and his daughters, whose names we don't know. That's why I left them blank. And we'll get to that story in a moment, through Moab, because there will be a princess from Moab by the name of Ruth, who will convert to Judaism and become the great-grandmother of King David. And once we have that final piece of the puzzle of the family of Terach, then we can really begin the kingship of the Jewish people through David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayam, through the kingship of David that will last forever. Okay, that's a fast forward snapshot of what we're going to do these next few weeks, but it all comes from this one family of Terach. And Avraham is born really into an imperialistic, idolatrous world. I mean, you think about some of the rough stops in Jewish history that we've had along the way. You think about the great tormentors of the Jewish people. You think about Hitler, Yamach Shemo. You think about Stalin, Yamach Shemo. You think about Ahmadinejad. You think about Khmelnytsky, Yamach Shemo. I mean, there's no shortage of the great long list of the tormentors of the Jewish people. So all those time periods was the time period that Avram was born into. The leader is a man by the name of Nimrod. If you ever, I believe I'm right, and Julie, I think, who's here with us, will correct me if I'm wrong, because she's a great linguist, that I think the word Nimrod in English actually comes from Nimrod, I believe. I think it's borrowed from the name Nimrod, though it's actually funny that if we have anyone here who is who's familiar with the culture of the modern day state of Israel, the name Nimrod is actually a very popular name in Israel. Not so much anymore, but like 20 years ago, it was a very popular name in Israel. And one of the reasons is because with the mentionings that Nimrod has in scripture, he sounds like a Gibor Chayil, or he's referred to as a Gibor Chayil, a strong warrior, and none of his negative traits, so to speak, are brought out in scripture. They're all brought out in rabbinic traditions and rabbinic homiletics. So if you look just at the scripture, it sounds like a Gibor Chayil. I want to name my son after Gibor Chayil, after a great warrior. So I'll name him Nimrod if all I know is the scripture, without the tradition of our rabbis. Once you bring in the tradition of our rabbis, you know that naming a kid Nimrod is paramount to naming a kid Adolf, right, or Hitler, or Stalin, right? It's basically the same thing, and that's the world that Avraham is born into. He's born into a tyrannical, imperialistic world, and it's in this backdrop that he becomes the first proto-Jew. That becomes the first person who's willing to preach monotheism to the world. Now, for the first number of years of his belief of monotheism, his mother hides him. His mother keeps him in hiding because she knows very well that his newfound beliefs, that he's ready, willing, and able to tell to the world, that if Nimrod, or the government, so to speak, is going to find out about them, it ain't going to be good for her son. So she hides him out for a number of years. Finally, at the age of 52, he, so to speak, has his coming out party, right? He comes out and says, enough hiding my beliefs. I'm ready to teach the world who I am. Now, before that point, let's just catch up in chronology over here. So we said Abraham's born in 1948, okay? Sarah was born in 1958, 10 years later. She's 10 years his junior. And they are married in 1973. Again, we're talking Jewish years over here. So 1973, Abraham and Sarah are married. Now, the Tower of Babel, which we discussed briefly last week, that happens in the Jewish year 1996, the year I graduated high school, right? No, right? Happened in the year 1996. So 4 years before Abraham, so to speak, comes out as a monotheist, but when Abraham's already alive and well in the scene. I mean, Abraham's 48 years old at the time of the Tower of Babel, so he is alive at that time. He lives through it. He lives through the dispersion. And we understand that that the main driver of the Tower of Babel was Nimrod. That was part of Nimrod's trying to exert himself in the world, was the building of the Tower of Babel. And that's the world that Abraham is born into. Okay, I'm going to pause here and just at this point see if we have any questions, comments, concerns about anything we've said so far. So, okay, someone texted me privately that the Nimrod does come from the word Nimrod, and actually until recently had positive connotations, not negative connotations. So, okay, so because they finally, learned the Midrashim and figured out that it's not positive. So it must have been what happened. Dan asks, how was Nimrod compared to Avram? That's a great question. I am not sure. I don't know if I've ever seen a recorded age for Nimrod. So yeah, I'll have to work on that. I'm not sure. Good question. We'll put the research committee on it. Okay, any other questions before we continue here? Okay, as always, if you have any questions while I'm running my mouth, you can either save them till the end and turn on your camera, turn on your mic and speak them out, or you can write them in the chat box and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. So, okay. Jewish year 2000. So, okay, someone said they don't have the family tree. Let me just send that one more time because that is a good thing to look at. Okay, this is the link to the family tree. And coming one more time. Here we go. There's the family tree. Yeah. Okay. One second. There we go. Boom, boom, boom. Yeah. So the Jewish year 2000. What happens at that point? Abraham's 52 years old. So not only was he born into the world that we described and lived through the events that we described, but his family's business was, according to the rabbis, according to the Midrashim, they were in the family business of making idols, right? That's what Terach did. He was an idol dealer. He was an idol maker. He didn't just sit around idle. He made idols. How's business? Thank God's, right? That's the business that Terach was in. And Avram was in the family business. But, in these 52 years, he's starting to grow and think about monotheism. And he's starting to think that this whole family business is a big charade. And he wants to think about a way to make the point clear to his family, make the point clear to his father. And so one day when his father leaves him in charge of the factory, leaves him in charge of the store, Avraham takes a huge hammer and smashes every single idol in the store and puts the hammer in the hands of the largest idol, which he leaves unsmashed. When Terach, the father, comes back, he inquires of his son, Avraham, what happened? And he goes, Dad, you're not going to believe what happened over here. This whole fight broke out between the different gods. One god said he was stronger than the next, and before you knew it, they were throwing blows at each other, and one idol was knocking over the other idol and driving the idols to the ground and breaking them up and causing all kinds of problems. And before you knew it, the biggest idol came out with his big hammer and smashed all of them, and he's the only one left standing. It was amazing. To which Terach says, Avraham, these idols are wood and stone. They can't fight. They can't talk. They can't break each other. They have no strength. To which Avraham, as the world's first yeshiva bacher, took out his proverbial thumb and said, if they can't talk, they can't think, and they don't have any strength, why are you worshiping them? Devastating theological question. So what does Terach do with his son who just destroyed his whole livelihood and asked him theological questions that he could not possibly understand? He takes him down finally and reports him to the evil king Nimrod as somebody who is threatening the government and doing treasonous behavior by threatening the gods of the people. So Terach, so Nimrod says to Avraham, what's going on over here? And he says, tells him the whole story. And he says, well, that's fine. There might be different gods out there that don't have any strength, but my God is the strongest God because my God's fire, and fire is the strongest, and I worship fire. So just don't mess with my God. You want to mess with other gods, that's fine, but don't mess with my God of fire. To which Avram asked Nimrod, 1 second, if fire is so strong, then why not then if you're concerned about worshiping the strongest of the gods, you shouldn't worship fire. You should worship water, because water can extinguish fire. Okay, says Nimrod, I'm easygoing. Water. We'll worship water over here. Mayim, misason, mimane hayeshua. Right? That's we'll worship water. But then Avram says, whoa, 1 second. If you want really the strongest, maybe you should worship wind, because you see, wind can just throw the water all around, make a tornado, make a tsunami, make tidal waves, make the waves go in and out, high tide, low tide, all those things, all caused by the wind. So you should really worship the wind. At which point Nimrod says, kid, I see what you're doing over here. I'm going back to fire, and we're going to see how well you stand up to fire. At which point he throws Avraham into a fiery furnace, and the Almighty performs his first miracle for Avraham. Avraham is not consumed by the flames. He goes into the furnace. He comes out of the furnace, gets the ash off his sleeves, and takes a bow, not even affected by the flames. Now, let's just paint that scene a little bit deeper. Notice we haven't mentioned any prophecy yet. Notice we haven't mentioned any communication whatsoever between the Almighty and Avraham yet. In other words, Avraham at this point is so willing to put it on the line and really put his life on the line for this belief of monotheism, and it's all coming from one place and one place only, his intellect. In other words, Avraham looks at the world, right? He doesn't have a father to teach him about monotheism. He doesn't have a great yeshiva to go. I mean, the yeshiva Shem Eber eventually ends up at, but no one's recruiting him there. He looks at the world and understands that every great creation must have a creator. You know, there's a famous story with the great Panovich Yeshiva in Bnei Brak, Israel. They once got some new appliance in the yeshiva, and when they were unpacking it and setting it up, one of the maintenance people said, "Well, where's the instruction manual to this thing?" So the mishkiach, who's like the dean of students in the yeshiva, walks past and hears this, and he says, "Well, how do you know that the appliance comes with an instruction manual?" To which the maintenance man looked at the mishkiach and said, "Rabbi, everything comes with an instruction manual." To which the mishkiach says, it's a raya the Torah min hashamayim. It's a proof that the Torah is from heaven. It's like, what are you talking about? He said, what did you just say? You said that everything in this world comes with an instruction manual, an appliance, a car, a toy, a computer. Everything comes with instruction manuals. So would the Almighty have created a world which is the most intricate of appliances, if you will, and not given an instruction manual? So Avram looked at the intricacies of the world, the intelligent design, if you will, of the world, and he said, there's no way this was random. There's no way this just came about. And there's no way that all these individual gods who remember, as we described polytheism, they weren't these great gods. They were bickering gods and fighting gods. Okay, they fought without moving and taking hammers like we described before, but there's no way they created the world. It must be one all-powerful, almighty God who did it. And he believes in it so deeply, only through his intellect, from his intellect down to his heart, which, as we described before, that's faith. Right? Faith is not like a leap of faith. That's not what leap of faith. There's no leaps of faith in Judaism. We explained before from Moshe Shapiro that emunah, faith, is thinking about something, working it out logically, practicing the logic of something until the logic penetrates down to your heart. And when the logic penetrates your heart, that's emunah. That's faith to a Jew. There's no leaps of faith. It's working on things, learning, studying, working on things logically till it penetrates your heart. That's faith. And that's where Abraham was. That's where Avram was before God even speaks to him. And he puts his life on the line. And Hashem performs his first miracle for him. Now, scene change. One of Avram's brothers, Haran, was very close to Avraham. In fact, he ends up being Avram's father-in-law slash brother. And he's very influenced by Avraham. He kind of gets the idea of monotheism. He thinks there's something to it. And he's watching the whole scene go down between Avram and Nimrod. And he says to himself, he says, if Avram survives, I'm with Avraham. But if Avram's going to die in this fiery furnace, I'm with Nimrod. Right? He's straddling the fence. When he sees Avraham come out alive, Nimrod next asks to Haran, says, Haran, who are you with? Are you with Abraham or are you with me? To which Haran says, I'm on team Abraham. So Nimrod says, fine. And he takes Haran, throws him in the furnace, and Haran dies. So the question is asked, why does the Almighty perform a miracle for Abraham and not perform a miracle for Haran? Well, there's many answers given. One answer is quite simply because, let's face it, miracles are not something that's simple, right? They're only, or at least open miracles where nature has changed, are only in very extreme circumstances, only at very specific times for very specific people. And Haran wasn't worthy of that because we see that his faith was only a mile wide and an inch deep, so much so that he more believed in Avraham than he believed in one God. So that's one take on it, that he wasn't worthy and he didn't have such a strong faith. So, he thought he was going to be treated like Abraham. He wasn't. My Rosh Hashiva, Shmuel Yaakov Weinberg, gives a different spin on it. He says that Haran knew what the situation was. Haran knew that he wasn't Avraham, and Haran knew that there's no way a miracle is going to be performed for him. But he looked at the situation and says, I don't know if I believe in this God of Abraham or not. But if this God of Abraham would let a terrible thing happen to a person as great as Abraham, then I don't believe in him. But if this God of Abraham would perform a miracle to save Abraham, then that's a God I'm willing to give up my life for. So when he saw that the Almighty performs a miracle and Avraham is saved from the fiery furnace, then Haran says, I'm on team God, and even if it means I'm giving up my life. Okay, that's my Rosh Hashiva explains it. That's the beginning of Abraham's great career as a monotheist. And for the next 18 years, Avraham teaches the world the ideas of monotheism without ever having a single prophecy. So much so that we see that Terach and his family have to leave their hometown of Ur-Kasdim. Ur-Kasdim is probably the same place as modern day Ur in Iraq, and they have to leave because they're being tormented by all those polytheistic business associates who are being driven out of business by the works of Avraham. And they go from Ur-Kasdim, they settle in a city called Haran, and at the age of 70 years old, Avram receives his first prophecy. And the Almighty tells him to go to the land of Canaan and go to seemingly what we now refer to as the Har HaBayis, the Temple Mount. And he makes with Avraham something that we refer to as the Bris Bein HaBasarim. Now, that translates into English as the covenant between the parts. Why do we call it the covenant between the parts? Because for whatever reason, the Almighty tells Abraham to take a number of animals, to cut them in half, and to walk in between their parts. That's the covenant between the parts. Now, at that time, the Almighty says a very scary words in that covenant, and the Almighty actually, when he's talking to Abraham, he says to him, he says to him, Yudu Teda, ki ger yezer brecha be'eretz lo lehem va'abdu v'inu osam arba me'er shana. He says that, if you're with me, let me go one verse before that. It says, that the sun sets and a great dread falls on Abraham. And the fear of darkness consumes him. So our sages tell us that what was going on over there, the Almighty, so to speak, was bringing out the contract for Abraham and saying, Avraham, past 18 years, you've been teaching the world about monotheism. You've sacrificed everything, sacrificed your livelihood, sacrificed your life. So much so, here's the final step. If you're going to be my guy, if you're going to be my progenitor, if you're going to be the one who's going to start my people, it ain't going to be easy because you're going to have a responsibility. Your responsibility is that you are going to have to be the moral compass in the world from this point forward. You're going to have to bring the ideas of monotheism against tyrannical polytheism out to the world and teach it to masses. And it's going to be an unpopular job. And your descendants are going to have a hard time with this. That if they don't get it just right and can't do it perfectly, they're going to go into exile. there's going to be attempts at genocide. There's going to be the Babylonians. There's going to be the Romans. There's going to be the Bar Kokhba revolt and the tragedy there. There's going to be Hadrian and Trajan, and there's going to be the Romans again as Christians, and there's going to be the Muslims, and there's going to be the Cossacks, and there's going to be Spain, and there's so forth and so on. God says everything to Abraham, all the way down to Hitler and Islamic terrorism in Israel today. He shows it all to him. He says, this is what you're signing up for. Are you sure you want to do it? And not only that, but you do a teda. You should surely know that your descendants are going to be strangers. This is going to how it's all going to start out. Your descendants are going to be strangers in a land that's not theirs. And they're going to be enslaved and inflicted and pained for 400 years. That's where it's going to start. That's the Kor HaBarzel, our sages call it, the refining oven to make the people that I need you to be. Because Abraham, in order to be the chosen people, that means you're chosen for responsibility. That means you're chosen to be the moral compass in the world. And we have to put into the spiritual DNA of your family the ability to be ger, yeh, zarecha. They have to be strangers. They cannot be dwellers. They cannot be residents. They have to be strangers. Why? Because they have to understand what it means to be a stranger. Because I'm going to command them to be kind to the stranger and to be able to reach out to everybody, do kindness. And they can't do that if they don't know what it's like to be a stranger. And it's going to need to happen for 400 years. And in those 400 years, should they get the lesson from simply being a stranger, then fine, we're good. But if not, says God, I'm going to have to kind of remind them they're a stranger. And this is the process we see once the descendants of Abraham come onto the world. The 400-year count starts with the birth of Isaac, because Isaac, for his whole life, is a stranger. He's not set in a place. He's not a resident. He's a stranger. He's not a citizen. He's a stranger. That's Isaac's life. And that's part of Yaakov's life. But then Yaakov has 12 sons, and they start to get a little more comfortable, and they start to have kids themselves, and they start to feel like, oh, maybe we're residents now. Maybe we're citizens now. Maybe we're not strangers anymore. And God says, whoa, that's not part of the deal. Your Zayda Avraham signed up for 400 years of being a stranger, and we're not there yet. Let's go down to Egypt. And for the first 130 years, it's enough just to be in Egypt to have, to be reminded that they were strangers, that they were not citizens. But then what happens is Joseph dies, the brothers die, that whole generation dies. That the Jewish people multiply and team and fill up the world. And the sages tell us that means that they started to become comfortable. They started to spread out. They started to multiply. They started to become more Egyptian than Jewish. They started to become Jewish Egyptians, or is it Egyptian Jews? I forget which one, right? They started to shorten their names from Tatovsky down to Tut, and they changed the shapes of their houses from squares to pyramids, and they started to walk sideways as opposed to walking frontways, and they started writing in hieroglyphics as opposed to writing in Hebrew. And God says, 1 second, guys. We tried just displacing you to get the 400 years of being a stranger. You're not looking at yourselves as citizens. We need 80 more years, because that's what Avram signed up for, to make you the people I need you to be. And that's the last 80 years in Egypt of the 80 years of slavery. Okay, we'll get to this more in depth in the next few sessions, but that's what Avram signs up for in this bris between the parts at the age of 70, to say that, God, I'm with you. I want to be the one. I want my descendants to be the ones to bring your message out to the world, whatever comes along with it, however difficult of a story and a destiny it's going to be. I'm signing on the dotted line. And that's what Avraham does in the Bris Bein Habesarim, the covenant between the parts. Now, the next 5 years is, our sages have a hard time kind of figuring out the chronology of, because while that Bris Bein Habesarim clearly happens in the land of Canaan, the family of Abraham is still living in Haran, in modern day Babylon, in Mesopotamia. And so Avram seems to just have made visits to the land of Canaan before he lived there. And somewhere in this process, we have something called the War of the 4 Kings and the 5 Kings. Now, this is basically, I like to refer to as World War I, because these 4 kings and 5 kings were basically the world powers at the time. And one of those kings is Amraphel, that's Nimrod, that's another name for Nimrod. And in this war, we see that Abraham's nephew slash brother-in-law, Lot, is captured by the 4 kings who are initially successful in the war. Avram hears about it, and he mounts a rebellion on behalf of the 5 kings who are losing the war, and is able to push back the 4 kings and change the tide in the war to that the 5 kings should win, Lot should be freed, and his progeny or his family, his mishpacha, should be okay. As one of my teachers, Rabbi Fran, once pointed out, that this story right here is Maisa Avasim in the Banim, again, a harbinger for future generations, that whenever there's something major going on in the world, the Jews are going to be right in the middle of it, even if it doesn't make sense, they're right in the middle of it. Right here, you had a war of 4 kings, 5 kings that like Abraham has nothing to do with, but somehow Abraham gets sucked in. Abraham makes a difference in the war. Abraham, is the rainmaker, so to speak, for the 5 kings. And right there, you have the harbinger for future generations. They were always going to be in the middle of any major happenings in the world. Be as it may, that happens sometime when Abraham is somewhere maybe 73 at the time, sometime between the age of 70 and 75. At 75, we have the first written prophecy to Abraham in the Torah, where he's told at the beginning of Parshas Lech Lecha, the Parsha gets his name by the commandment that the Almighty gives him at this point. Avraham is told, Lech Lecha me'artzecha u'mi moladetecha u'mi beis avicha el haaretz asher areka. Go from your land, from your father's house, from your land, from where you're born, from your father's house, to the land that I will show you. This is God's way of saying, at this point, Abraham, leave it all behind, right? Leave your family behind, leave your father behind, leave whatever inheritance you have behind, leave it all behind. It's time to come to the land I'm going to show you. And that happens when he's 75 years old. Now, structurally in the Torah, this happens between the covenant between the parts. Big discussion as to why it is, but Avram's 75 at the time when he's told to leave and go to the Eretz Canaan, which eventually become Eretz Yisrael. Now, as soon as he gets there, he has to leave because it's hit with famine. And so as much as, he thinks he's having this new beginning as God's man, as the progenitor of the Jewish people, nope, you got to go down to Egypt because there's a famine. And that's where we have the whole story of Sarah being abducted by the Pharaoh. And it's just, as we've described, a very difficult life that he has. Okay. The year 2034. Avraham and Sarah at this point have been married since the year 1973. So if you do your math, that means they've been married almost 60 years. And Sarah is barren. Sarah has not had children. So God has made all these promises that, your descendants are going to be a great nation, and we're going to build this great monotheistic nation. And Sarah comes up with an idea that she should give her handmaid to Abraham to have progeny with, and then together they'll raise this child to be the family of monotheism. Now, that child that is born to Hagar is Ishmael. And it's interesting because in the exchange between Sarah and Hagar and Ishmael, it's a very interesting story over there. So first of all, who is Hagar? Hagar we understand to be the princess of Egypt. When Abraham and Sarah were down in Egypt, Hagar, the princess, becomes so impressed with Sarah and Avraham that she wants to be part of whatever it is that they're doing. So she becomes, as we would say in Yeshiva, the Talmud Muvak. She becomes the main student of Sarah to learn these ideas of monotheism. And so much so that if you read on the surface, sometimes it seems like, okay, Sarah's just taking her, like her handmaid and saying, go have a child. But no, this is her right-hand lady, right? This is her main student. This is the next best thing to Sarah Imenu at this point as far as monotheistic thought goes. Now, what happens with Hagar? Once she becomes pregnant right away from Avram, she says, oh, 1 second. My teacher, Sarah, well, she was with Avram for 60-something years and never became pregnant. I'm with Avram one night and I became pregnant. Maybe I'm the better one over here. Maybe the pupil has surpassed the teacher over here. So Hagar starts to get a little bit haughty about herself. And Sarah looks at this and says, oh, well, 1 second, one second. Hagar, you're not the lady I thought you were. Here I thought you were better than this, you're above this. And she tells Avram, she says, like, we got problems over here. And Avram says, she's your student. Do what you want with her. So if you read the verses, it makes Sarah sound like this terrible woman who is jealous and oppresses her maidservant who got pregnant, and poor Hagar. Again, you can't read anything in the Torah and understand without the words of our rabbis. Our rabbis explained that what did Sarah do to Hagar? She stopped teaching her. Right? Hagar was a very spiritually developed lady and was learning from Sarah. And if you take a spiritually developed person and a person who's thirsting for knowledge, and you cut off the wellspring of knowledge, it's torment. And that's what Sarah does to Hagar, because she says to Hagar, you think you're greater. You don't need me anymore to teach you. And Hagar is tormented by this, ends up running away. An angel comes, tells her to go back. And then after the child is finally born, the child seems to not be the type of child they want, at which point Sarah says to Avraham, like, we got to get them out of here because they're just not on Team God, so to speak. And Avram doesn't want to get rid of them because this is his son, for crying out loud. So Avram turns to the Almighty and says, what do I do? And the Almighty says, listen to your wife, right? Great advice from God, which I agree that everyone should do. Listen to your wife. And so Avram listens to Sarah, and they banish Yishmael and Hagar. And we'll talk more about Yishmael next week and the nation that he ends up developing. But it ends up essentially being a failed plan to progenate the Jewish people. But we're going to see it ends up being very much a part of the puzzle to build monotheism in the world, because Yishmael is going to become the great grandfather of the Muslim people, which will take monotheism to 1/3 of the world. Okay. 2048, at the age of 100, we have angels that come to visit Avraham. And one of these, we have Avram, who's given a commandment of bris milah, to circumcise himself. In other words, that to show that he is, so to speak, on Team God, the Almighty says, we're going to put it actually on your skin. We're going to put it on your body. And Avram is circumcised, Yishmael is circumcised, the whole household is circumcised. And then we have the situation where a number of angels come to visit Avram when he's sick. They say he's going to actually have his own child. Sarah thinks it's funny. She laughs. That's where the name Yitzchak comes from. Schayk is laughter in Hebrew. And then the angels go to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and the 5 cities over there, because it is a place that has met its demise as far as bringing anything holy into this world. That happens to be where Lot lives, our friend Lot from before. And a miracle is performed for Lot because he is the progeny of Avraham. And we see that Lot is saved long enough to procreate and give us what will eventually become Ruth. And we'll talk about that more when we get to King David. But it's very fitting that we mentioned it here before Shavuos, because we do read the book of Ruth on Shavuos. And eventually, 1 year after this situation, Yitzchak is finally born. And we see that Avram and Sarah finally have progeny. They finally have a descendant. And we will discuss his life and times more next week. Now, Pirkei Avos, the ethics of our fathers, teaches us that there were 10 tests that Abraham was tested with. Now, there's a funny thing that Mishnayos quite often do, is they give you a number for something. Even the Talmud does this a lot. It'll give you a number for something, but not define those numbers. And that's what it does here in the case of Abraham. The Mishnah tells us that Abraham had 10 tests, but doesn't tell us what those 10 tests were. And sure enough, there is a dispute amongst the rabbis as to what exactly these 10 tests were. The 2 major schools of thought are that of Rashi and the Ramban, Rashi and Nachmanides. And the fundamental difference between the two is Rashi includes in his count of 10 tests, even tests that are from the rabbinical homiletics, they're from the Midrashim. Ramban is of the belief that the tests have to be mentioned in scripture. So therefore, that's where their tests diverge. If you're I included on the outline the 10 tests of according to Rashi's count. If you're interested in the Ramban's count, it's spelled out clearly in the Ramban in the English edition, or in the Art Scroll Chumash, spells them both out. But we'll go through Rashi's 10 because that includes the Midrashim and the whole story of Rashi. So test number 1 was that he started off his life in hiding, like we said before. By the way, talking about the harbinger for future generations, What other great leader had to start off his life in hiding because there was a fear that the government was going to kill him? Moshe, right? We know that Moshe was hid for 2 months, 3 months before he is discovered by the Egyptians. So that the harbinger is from Abraham, because Abraham is hid in the beginning of his life. Okay, test number 2, he's thrown into the fiery furnace. Test number 3, he's told to leave everything behind, leave his family, leave his homeland. Test number 4 is the famine right after he comes to Canaan, and he has to go down to Egypt. Test number 5 is when Sarah is kidnapped by Pharaoh. Test number 6 is where he has to go to war to rescue Lot. Test number 7 was the covenant between the parts, being told what the destiny of the Jewish people is going to look like. Test number 8 is the test at the age of 100 or 99 to be circumcised, which was not an easy surgery for a 99-year-old. And test number 9 is when he's told to send Ishmael away, which we'll get into more next week. And test number 10 is the binding of Isaac, which we will talk about more next week. And these are the 10 tests of Avraham, which through these 10 tests, it paints on our spiritual DNA a concept that we see often, which is that we are the Am Kshe Oref, that we are a stiff-necked people. That's what the Almighty refers to us as at the time of the golden calf. And that is both a blessing and a curse. It's a curse because we're obstinate, right? We have tremendous obstinance. And I would say it's one of the biggest proofs that the Torah must be divine and that every word of it is divine is because the Jewish people are such an obstinate people from time immemorial that how could you convince such an obstinate people to accept completely, unilaterally, one book, one edition, not multiple editions, but one unified edition as divine if it's such an obstinate people? Like, look at the stories we tell about how we argue with everyone every turn of the way. With Moshe, with God, we're always arguing and being stiff-necked, and that's our greatest downfall, but it's our greatest achievement also. It's our greatest ability, and it's part of how we've been here until this day, because the holier side of that obstinance is we are able to stand up to the great tormentors throughout history, and that in many ways is painted on our DNA. It's inscribed in our DNA by the life and times and the 10 tests of Avram Avinu, of Abraham. I thank you all for coming. I thank you for listening, and join us next week as we talk about. Next week will be the discussion of Avraham and Ishmael. We're going to delve into the life and times and the times that they live, but then we're also going to get a bit into the eternal conflict, because for us nowadays, it is such a fresh conflict. So it'll be the struggle is real, Isaac and Ishmael. That will be our discussion for next week as we will continue the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. Okay. My wonderful research committee gave me a response to Deanne's question as far as the age of Nimrod. And it's according to what the research committee tells me is that Nimrod was born in the year 1751, which would put him at about 200 years older than Abraham. Okay, that is the answer to Deanne's question about the age of Nimrod. Okay, any other questions? You can put them in the chat box. You can speak them out. You can turn on your mic and turn on your camera and throw in any questions, comments, concerns that you might have. Okay, I either totally confused everybody or just said it so clear that you have nothing to say. I want to thank you all for coming, and I look forward to next week when we'll continue the story of Isaac and Ishmael. The struggle is real, and until then, everybody have an absolutely wonderful week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.